a very quick word, if I may, about the Delphi definition of dyslexia. Now, the Delphi definition of dyslexia was brought in sort of late 2024 by SASC, the Specialist Assessment Standards Committee. This is basically the organisation in the United Kingdom, or at least in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, that deals with assessments for special educational needs or specific learning difficulties. SASC. What SASC noticed, and they were quite right to notice this, is that there was no, what you might call, universally accepted definition of dyslexia, which allowed for universal pathways for, as it were, coherent and cohesive testing. So to give you an idea of that, I ran a project called the Dyslexia Compass. Take a look at the Dyslexia Compass, really interesting project. And we looked at different ways of assessing for dyslexia around the continent of Europe. Well, it turns out that without, as it were, a cogent, coherent, stable pathway for assessment in the United Kingdom, the danger became that there was no single way of assessing for dyslexia, and SASC oversaw the creation, as it were, of the Delphi definition of dyslexia. The Delphi definition of dyslexia is supposed to provide a universal definition of dyslexia. Gathering 58 experts, and they said international experts, in dyslexia, from researchers to educational psychologists to educators to diagnostic assessors. So gathering 58 specialists, international experts in dyslexia. The people who came up with the Delphi definition, which was supposed to be this universalized pathway for diagnosis, covered 6 main areas. Let's have a look at them here. Now, if I can remember right, these 6 different aspects were the definitions of dyslexia, the abilities of dyslexia, the impact of dyslexia over a lifetime, the etiology of dyslexia, misconceptions of dyslexia, and comorbidities and co-occurrences that are associated with dyslexia. Phew. Now, often when I look at dyslexia, I look at most definitions, and you can include the Delphi definition in this, as comprising really 4 key sections: the type, the origin, the effect, and the value. So in this case, the type is, as it were, it's developmental. It's a developmental, and they say it's a developmental continuation of difficulties. The origin, they say it's both, or it can be both, genetic and environmental. The effect, well, you're talking about acquisition of reading skills, you're talking about phonological components, working memory, orthography, processing speed, that kind of thing. And in terms of value, this is where it gets quite interesting. The words it uses include weakness, and I think they use weakness 4 times, difficulty, severity, impairment, problems. In other words, all the values that they place on dyslexia, as you can hear, are quite negative, quite, as it were, pathological. Now, this isn't a massive surprise, considering that the point of the Delphi definition was to come up with a pathway for diagnosticians, and diagnosticians tend to look for negatives. That's what they look for. You know, you very seldom get any diagnostician that goes, right, let's look for the positives. They just don't do that. So what you've got is you've got a definition that caters to the needs of diagnosticians who are looking for problems and weaknesses. So when they look at the deficits, the negatives, and they call them deficits, they look at dyslexia as that's what they call it, a developmental difficulty. They look at this as it were, reading and spelling processing difficulties that provide, as it were, that lead to weak literacy attainment. And on top of that, as it were, these are fluency difficulties. And they discuss it as a cognitive impairment in processing and in phonological processing. So dyslexia is looked upon as deficits, as a cognitive impairment, as weaknesses in literacy attainment and phonological processing. So that's what you might call the deficit side of the Delphi definition of dyslexia. But it's not only deficit-based, because they also talk about comorbidities, co-occurrences. Now, these are essentially overlaps with other things. Things like, they mention math skills, they mention motor skills. So often dyslexia co-occurs with maths problems, it co-occurs with motor problems. This could be dyscalculia and dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder. It could be simply math skills and motor skills. It could be a whole range of maths and motor problems. Other things that it co-occurs with is difficulties learning other languages, literacy attainment. They kind of say that it co-occurs with that, and developmental language disorder, which is, a lot of people would say that's another word for dyslexia. So it's not 100% clear. But yeah, these are co-occurrences with maths, motor skills, literacy attainment, orthographic comprehension and understanding, the acquisition of language skills, fluency in reading, fluency in comprehension, that kind of thing. And of course, processing speed. Although processing speed in itself is something that might need to be cleared up a little bit for quite a few people. Different types of processing speed may be at stake here, and what do we mean by processing speed? So for instance, you could say that the information shoots up and down your mini columns at the same speed with dyslexia and non-dyslexia, but the dyslexic mini columns, and this is something I might talk about later, the dyslexic mini columns are taller, so it takes longer to shoot up and down the mini columns. But that doesn't mean your processing speed is necessarily any slower. So there's a little bit of a discussion to be had there as well. And then there's what you might think of as context. So there's deficit, comorbidity, and context here. And the context is that it's, you've got a weakness, and they use this word weakness relative to your age, relative to your teaching, so the teaching that you've had, relative to environmental factors such as your family influence and your family history. It may be weak relative to other skills that you have. It may be dependent on the environment that you've lived in. And of course, it may be co-occurrent with lots of other things. And so it's difficult to pinpoint specifically and precisely where the dyslexia is, unless you look at it simply as a weakness of phonological processing or a weakness of literacy attainment. And this is one of the questions that's inherent within the Delphi definition. And the point of this is, as I say, to provide what they call a universal pathway or a stable pathway for diagnosis and for intervention. And to be able to do this, they came up with four guidelines. The first of these is to consider what else might be at stake if somebody has weak literacy processing or weak literacy skills. So what else might be going on? Could it be family? Could it be something, as it were, more of a global intellectual issue? Could there be emotional issues at home? Could there be, if you like, a resistance to learning? All sorts of things. So consider what else might be going on. The second is to gather as much information as you can and intervene as early as you can. And this is crucial, to be honest with you, because with any kind of dyslexia intervention, the earlier the better, and the studies are really clear on this. The third is kind of dependent on that, which is what you then do is you observe and you record whether these interventions work. And finally, if the interventions aren't working, then pass the child on for specialist assessment or specialist sort of treatment with somebody who might know what they're talking about really, really quickly. And so what you've got is consider what else is going on. You've got gather all the information you can, intervene as soon as you can. Then you've got observe and record what happens when you do that. And then if there's a problem, if you like, escalate, pass what's going on up a stage to somebody else who might know better. So this is essentially what the Delphi definition is for, what it is, and what it helps you do as maybe a teacher or a diagnostician. They call it a universalized pathway. I think it's really important to understand that the way it's set out, it doesn't look like a universalized pathway. It looks like a standardized pathway for the English, Welsh and Northern Irish context. So it's not universalised. It's not even universalised into the Scottish context. So when they say it's a universalised pathway, I think we need to tread carefully with that particular statement. But what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to bring together practitioners in the United Kingdom so that a standardised set of practices can be adhered to. And at the very least, that's not a bad thing, because where there are no standard sets of practices, you get inconsistent diagnoses, you get inconsistent numbers of kids who are said to have dyslexia or not to have dyslexia, you get inconsistent interventions, you might get inconsistent financial aid from local authorities, you might therefore end up with rising inequality between school attainment in certain parts of the country. All sorts of these problems might occur. So the idea of standardising the understanding of dyslexia within most of the United Kingdom is a really good idea. So at the very least, that's what the Delphi definition of dyslexia gives us.